Hello, so I'm Thomas Pringle. I'm an assistant professor here in Division of Cinema and Media Studies, and tonight I'm going to be introducing our panel moderator, who will also be introducing our panelists, Dr. Marc Francis. So if we could all welcome him when he comes up on to the podium here. So Dr. Marc Francis is the film programming manager at Yale University and associate editor of Film Quarterly. Until recently, he worked at Paramount Pictures and before that, HBO and Warner Brothers Discovery. His book, Deviant Repertories, is about the programming of canonical queer films in the 1970s and the 1980s U.S. art house cinemas, and it's forthcoming on Duke University Press. He's a contributor to the Oxford Handbook of Queer Cinemas on Oxford University Press, and has also published articles in Camera Obscura, Jump Cut, Media Fields, and Film Quarterly. So, welcome, Marc.
Okay, can everyone hear me back there? Ross, can you hear me? Great. Okay. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Some more thank yous. Thank you especially to the USC School of Cinematic Arts and J.D. Connor in particular for helping organize this with us at Film Quarterly. And thank you also to Rebecca Prime, Film Quarterly's editor-in-chief, and to the Ford Foundation's Just Films initiative for their generous ongoing support of Film Quarterly and for helping fund this event. So I'm going to now introduce our esteemed panelists, and I'm going to invite them up right now to take their seats and welcome them. And then after that, I will say just a few words to kind of frame this panel tonight and introduce the topic before we launch into a conversation. Okay, so starting here from your left is Jennifer Holt. Jennifer Holt is an associate professor and chair of film and media studies at UC Santa Barbara. She is the author of Empires of Entertainment and Cloud Policy, A History of Regulating Pipelines, Platforms, and Data, which is out already.
Coming out in August.
Thank you.
Woo!
MIT Press. She's also the co-editor of the Sage Handbook of the Digital Media Economy, Distribution Revolution, Connecting Viewing, Selling Streaming, and Sharing Media in the Digital Age, and Media Industries History, Theory, and Method. Holt is a co-founder and editorial collective member of the Media Industries Journal. To her left is Courtney Brannon Donoghue, who is an assistant professor of media industry studies in the Department of Media Arts at the University of North Texas. Her research areas include conglomerate Hollywood and international operations, local language productions, Brazilian media, female-driven filmmaking, and production and distribution cultures. She's the author of The Value Gap, Female-Driven Films from Pitch to Premiere, Localizing Hollywood, and co-editor of Digital Media Distribution, Portals, Platforms, Pipelines. She is a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Award for faculty at Hispanic serving institutions. Okay, to her left is Alfred L. Martin Jr., who is an associate professor of media studies in the Department of Cinematic Arts at the University of Miami. He's the author of The Generic Closet, Black Gayness and the Black Cast Sitcom, and editor of Rolling, Blackness and Mediated Comedy, both from Indiana University Press. Martin is currently finishing On the Black Hand Side, Black Fandom and Cultural Politics, which is through NYU Press, a monograph about Black fan practices. To his left is Nitin Govil, who is an associate professor here at the Cinematic Arts at USC. His research and teaching focuses on comparative cultural politics with an emphasis on transnational media industries. He is the author of Orienting Hollywood, A Century of Film Culture Between Los Angeles and Bombay, and one of the co-authors of Global Hollywood and Global Hollywood 2. He is currently working on a new book on transnational media and Cold War legacies titled Out of Alignment. And then finally, last but not least, J.D. Connor is an associate professor of cinematic arts here at USC as well, and Alma and Alfred Hitchcock Family Chair. He is the author of The Studios After the Studios in Hollywood, Math and Aftermath, and currently working on a book about diagrams and the transition to late capitalism in 1970s called The Image of the Social. He writes a monthly column called City of Industry that ran in the LA Review Books also known as LARP, and is now looking for a new home. You can sign up at, I can't believe you're gonna make me say this, John Connor, like in the Terminator.com. Perfect. So I'm gonna talk about the Terminator in just a moment. So yes, please give us a round of applause for Okay, so this panel has been sort of several years in the making. I got the idea back in 2018, 2019, when I first sensed that, for me, something had really shifted in the movie franchises that I had been watching. And so I just want to just name a few touch points here to get us kind of warmed up and to set the stage a bit. So first of all, I think, it was on the poster for this event. One thing that's on everyone's mind is the Infinity Saga, right? AKA Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in which 17 films that had been released, through the years prior culminated in this sort of like mega sequel, right, to a network of origin stories and sequels as well. And so we got, of course, an end with Endgame. And then another touch point for me is the 2022 Scream, which was the 5th in the series. And for me, that franchise's reference points to sort of horror tropes, especially films, from the canon. They had suddenly shifted. This last film, things had suddenly shifted to then actually being references to previous Scream films. And this was under the title of Stab, which is sort of like diegetically chronicles the Woodboro murders over the years, and these are the kind of murders that take place in Scream. So Scream is often thought of as this postmodern text, but yet there was this move from like referentiality to self-referentiality, and it made me wonder if even thinking of it as a postmodern text still holds, or if we need some other terms or frameworks. Okay, so then lastly for me was the 2019 Terminator, Dark Fate. Did anyone raise your hand if you saw Terminator Dark Fate? Okay, more people than I thought, because every time I bring it up to people, they look at me like, what are you talking about? That even was released. So everyone knows the premise of Terminator, right? The machines will one day annihilate the human race, and the good guys are racing to both save this leader of the human race and also sort of stop this sort of cybernetic Armageddon from happening. And so by the time that this installment was released, it seemed to me that there were sort of these obvious narrative challenges to returning this sort of inevitability installment after installment. And by this iteration, the film seems so aware that it's sort of stuck in this sort of game of whack-a-mole, where Sarah Connor has to kind of ward off this number of potential cyber-apocalyptic futures. So I wondered watching that if we might read this actually as like sort of an allegory for a certain crisis in expansive serialization itself, and its sort of strained attempts to sustain narrative coherence across time. So since roughly, again, 2018, 2019, I've been sort of on the lookout for in-depth scholarly thinking on the state of these sort of networked blockbuster serial narratives. And while there's been a lot of journalistic coverage on this topic, and there's been critical acknowledgement of the current kind of ubiquity of franchises, and there's obviously been a lot on also finance and Hollywood, I haven't yet seen sort of in-depth analysis or like dossiers on specifically the franchise and how we got here to this point in history and what the implications are for it. So this panel aims to sort of start to fill this gap, it's aiming to fill this gap to discuss, of course, the industrial and financial structures of the franchise today, as well as the relationships of those structures to narrative form, to fan and audience cultures, and global currents of content production and distribution. So now I'll begin with just asking the panelists some questions, and I'm hoping that will just sort of flow into a conversation. And then towards the end, we will leave some time for you, the audience, to ask questions or respond to any of the panelists' points. Okay, so we're going to start with Jennifer. So Jennifer, let's just start with thinking broadly historical here. The movie franchise, of course, is nothing new. It doesn't emerge in this last decade. So how does the phenomenon emerge within the film industry? What was the thought behind them originally, and when do we see the paradigm kind of quote unquote come of age, so to speak?
Okay, thank you. I wrote some thoughts down about the history that I can try to cover in 3 to 5 minutes. Looking back allows us to look at this type of property and how it's been promoted and embraced over time. And I always think about it as connected to patterns of ownership and corporate structure, in addition to things like IP creation and licensing practices and formatting strategies. When we think of franchises, we think about something that is an original source narrative or property that, whether a novel, a comic, a film, a video game, that kind of spawns a host of related projects and properties across media domains. And the modern franchise is usually discussed as originating in the conglomerate era. So formative examples include the Bond series in the 60s and Jaws and Star Wars in the 70s. But I like thinking back. I think there's a lot of important predecessors in looking in the 1930s and the 40s, Universal horror films, which, the peak for me there is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948, which is an amazing kind of crossover horror comedy and also a great example of how to exploit IP in a horizontally integrated company. Abbott and Costello also met the Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and the Mummy, and these monsters would all return decades later on screens and theme parks and as video games. And Avi Santo has also written about the role of licensing, branding, and merchandising in the construction of media franchises going back to 1930s and the era of radio, looking specifically at the Lone Ranger. So I think it's important to kind of think about some of these early examples and understand that the franchise drive and this kind of strategy was born and developed long before TV even existed. And there truly is, like David said, there's nothing new under the sun. And while we don't think of classic network TV as like a rich source of franchise properties, I like the work of Todd Gitlin and the way that he talks about in Inside Primetime the recombinant culture of the 1970s, which generated TV shows that produced a whole series of spin-offs and sequels, like Mary Tyler Moore that begat Rhoda and Phyllis and Lou Grant, and All in the Family, which created Maude and Good Times and the Jeffersons, and I mean, even Gloria. I don't know if people remember Gloria, which was a total bummer of a show. Like, I think Mike left her to live on a commune, all this weird stuff. But they weren't franchises in the classic sense, but they're like a loosely connected group of shows that are often united by a parent company or production executive that undeniably exhibit like an expansive derivative orientation around IP and narrative and characters that are found in the franchising business practices of today. And I think we can look back at, obviously, Star Trek, which is a really weird example of a franchise property that is one of the most successful in history, but starts off super weak with a very low-rated TV show in 1969 that was canceled, ultimately rehabilitated by the fans, and has since spawned 8 live-action series, 3 animated series, 13 films, novels, games, and a very unconventional model for franchise success, given that it begins with a very crappy TV show, unsuccessful TV show on NBC. And then, the way we usually kind of zero in is thinking about the Time Warner merger in 1989 and subsequent consolidation of film studios and broadcast and cable networks and publishing houses and theme parks that took place throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And we begin to see these giant tentpole blockbuster films that exist to leverage IP across a studio's distribution outlets, and Batman is the kind of quintessential example. But of course, the whole DC property, all the DC properties have been critical to the company ever since. And once Disney bought Marvel in 2009, then we have like the undisputed champion of licensing and branding starts to leverage their resources to maximize this universe. But only then, after their takeover of Fox, 24th Century Fox film and TV assets, actually in 2019, 10 years later, were they able to also utilize X-Men and the Fantastic Four characters, as those rights were sold to Fox in the 90s. And they buy Lucasfilm in 2012. And these kind of purchases and their franchise-based strategy seems to have worked out very well for them. In 2019, they had a third of the domestic market share on just 10 theatrical releases, 9 of which were franchise pictures. But whether it's worked out for film lovers, I guess we can talk about that. And then I also want to throw out the rise of the TV franchise, which has taken over the entire network of Bravo in its kind of many splendored iterations of reality TV, like The Real Housewives, Below Deck, which is, I think, why Nitin came today.
Get there.
Summer House, $1 Million Listing, Vanderpump Rules, all the shows that populate my life. And we also have the scripted franchises of Dick Wolf, Law and Order, SVU, Criminal Intent, which are also used as formats for global exports, which is kind of an interesting piece of franchising, which maybe we can talk about. And the Kardashian verse and the franchising of an influencer family and their content bots and their beauty and fashion empires, which is, I think, a really interesting other piece of it. And I guess I'm coming up on time, but I do want to also point to the role of franchises in streamers. And JD's written about the importance of the Marvel Cinematic Universe to Disney Plus, and the company's many other franchises like Star Wars have been super critical to its success. Star Trek was essential for the launch of CBS All Access and then Paramount Plus. And I think when we look to the digital era, these franchises still reveal patterns of control and the importance of IP and the value of legacy studio content over time, and how truly challenging it is for platforms like Netflix, which has some success with Stranger Things and maybe Selling Sunset, I don't know, and Amazon, which has not. You could think of Citadel, which is a $300 million disaster, to create franchise properties. It's easy to exploit them, but it's not so easy to develop them online. And the idea of franchise fatigue is also real. You know, the Broccoli family viewed the value of James Bond in its spectacle and its scarcity. So they were not interested in a 007 TV series. They wanted to keep that limited. And so that's not the ethos of today's franchise-loving producers, but it'll be interesting to see as these conglomerates evolve and the film studio continues to shrink in importance to the bottom line, at least. Will the theatrical films continue to drive the franchise model, or how much, as television continues to scale up and operations and important to that dynamic, how that will be reflected in the identity of these corporations? So I think I'll stop there.
No, that's like that's enough pause on that one. But I mean, what a comprehensive list, and it really does start to beg the question of it's a strain to almost think about what is not a franchise these days, right? And so I think this actually is a good segue to the question for Courtney. So at one time, in terms of film franchises, they'd be mostly comprised of sequels, right? With narrative events that predominantly happened in succession, right? Occasionally with prequels. But now we have requisite prequels. And we also have spin-offs and reboots, remakes, and I think Marvel's a great example of this, multiple intersecting kind of narrative trajectories that sort of elude traditional serialization. And they're all happening across different media and platforms. So as you just spoke, Jennifer, you alluded to across film and TV / streaming, and of course, and there's also social media, and with these kind of merchandise and product tie-ins that are also not necessarily new. But given all of this, Courtney, I'm wondering about the term franchise itself. And I guess the question is, do you think the term is adequate to these kind of immense enterprises and these kind of intermedial convergences, some of which Jennifer just described?
I know. This is a tough one. I also wrote down some key words and notes. I just taught a class about media franchising, and that started the semester with that question. We ended the semester with that question. I don't know what kind of how strong of an answer we came up with, but yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea of franchising is not being new, as something that, and also not being Hollywood, and that's something that I'll mention in a second. It's not just by locating us, limiting us in this kind of Hollywood space only. The idea of what context is really important when you're thinking about franchising. The site of where you're looking at, whether you are thinking about ownership structures, which I also start with that very much in most of my classes, the way I'm thinking of my own work, thinking about economic mandates, so intellectual property risk, how are different properties valued in different ways than others, who is allowed access to different franchise properties is something that I'm really interested in my own work. So who is allowed access to the resources to either have the creative control or creative hands on a franchise, who is not, what are considered valuable franchises, what are not considered valuable franchises. I mean, that's the reality TV question versus maybe a bigger studio, a franchise. Thinking about technological shifts and how that's changed the way the franchises are serialized, how they move and travel and change. A lot of my work has been about talking to people in middle management in studios and or people working above the line. So I'm very interested in who is working on these franchises, thinking about labor and sites of industry work, and what does that look like when you're talking to somebody on a franchise who is been a writer for hire on Frozen 2. Versus the person who is working in marketing, right, for the theatrical distribution, versus somebody who is, I had another example here about where it went. Thinking about all these different, this is the way my brain works in terms of that. And so I think that, franchising is everything and nothing at once. It's a term that's everything, it's vague, it's wherever you want it to be, whatever kind of the context is. Yeah. And so if you're looking at something that is a cinematic universe, whether it's Disney, Marvel, or you're looking at something like, I keep going back to this kind of idea of failure, success, value. And so when something like Fast and the Furious is a really a franchise I'm really fascinated in, because of the fact that where 2001 you have a string of 2 hit, modestly budgeted movies. You have a third one that's financially unsuccessful. They're going to take it to a straight to DVD franchise. It gets revived, and then what are we at 10 now?
Yeah.
What was the budget? What was it, 250? The last one, 3? It was 3? Yeah. So I mean, the journey, thinking about franchises, the journey of the franchises. Thinking about another example would be. Thinking about something like Sex and the City, something that has, part of this moment, this quality TV moment of HBO figuring out themselves as a network of original programming in the 90s, and the show emerging and how this property is being managed by Time Warner, now Warner's Discovery, and how that as though you follow those kind of iterations of this media property and how this franchise evolves, and looking at that in terms of ownership and what does that mean? Can we use the word franchise for that, right? When you have this hit TV show, and then you have a couple of movies. I'm going to act like the second one doesn't exist.
So offensive.
It's so bad.
But it features Liza butchering single ladies.
Fair.
And camels. And then now you have the revival. So the term I would add to your list of reboot, revival, remake. I mean, it was revival, right?
Revival.
And so that seems
Yeah.
another term of
it's
what happens when we bring back the original cast or the original writers, or like what when we're trying to recreate what does that look like, and how does that fit within our understanding of franchising, less as a product and more as a process. And so I'm really interested in that. I always tell people, and I'm sorry if you've heard me say this before, I'm a research methods nerd. I love talking about methods because I do interviews. I like to do participant on-site observations. I like to spend time talking and like longitudinal, long time talking about following case studies or people through their work or through something from development to distribution. And I think that looking at kind of long tail, I guess, of these franchises through these different like historical lenses or distro lenses is really interesting. And I will also add the other side of me that spent a lot of time thinking about Hollywood's relationship to other industries in the world, Hollywood's positions in other industries in the world. Like, what does a franchise look like within my own past work on the Brazilian context, right? Like one of the biggest markets in Latin America, one of the biggest markets in the world, and that's what blockbusters look like. Like theatrically released blockbuster films in Brazil are they're franchises that are with sequels. They're comedies. They come from properties that came off of Global, which is their very big, very powerful television network. And so, like, what does a franchise look like within the context of one of the largest markets out, in the global South, one of the largest markets, in Latin America? How does franchising and the kind of logic work there? And talking to some people who work in Global and work in that conglomerate, and the way they think about the connections between the television network and thinking about their streaming service, which is called Global Play, and thinking about their film division, Global Filmies, and thinking about the various media divisions they have and how they all kind of have to work together. The kind of compare and contrast is really interesting, and something that I've been thinking more about in the streaming era and what that looks like.
Yeah, that negotiation between the global and the local.
Exactly.
On that a bunch.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting what you said about the success, failure, value framework, because
I just wrote a book about value, so I'm very obsessed with the constructions of value in the industry. Yeah.
And it made me think about Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was supposed to be a really promising property, right? It had established fandom, right, built into it, and yet it didn't do well. And so there's a sense that it's probably not going to actually become the franchise that Paramount had hoped it would be. And so that's an interesting example of it was meant to,
it checks the box, right? You have like Chris Pine, who is supposed to be in all these, he's in various franchises, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a striking example, and it actually leads us into a good question about fans, because the fans couldn't be the ones to keep that at least for now, that property afloat. And so, Al, going to you then about sort of fan cultures. We know that they play a pivotal role in franchise content production. Audience responses lead to all kinds of online chatter and commentary that then likely influences the development process. So can you talk a little bit about that fan influence, and are certain kinds of IP, and perhaps we can think about TV versus film here, or certain kinds of TV, reality versus whatever, that are more subject to this fan discourse influence than others?
Sure. So the first thing that I will sort of start by saying is that as a general rule, the fans with the most power are the people with the most power, and then that's white people. And so, in other words, like if we sort of talk about value, we talk about the ways that, for example, the revival, the television revival mania, for example, has never hit black cast television. It's hit Will and Grace, it's hit Roseanne, and even when Roseanne flamed out, they refigured out a way to do it without her, and we went off to the races. And Murphy Brown came back, and all of these shows came back. But what we don't do is we don't actually value audiences of color. So there's no Moesha reboot. Curses. Mara Bracakeel has been all over the industry, selling her wares, trying to sort of move the game to different sort of platforms, because there's not really a valuation of Black audiences generally and audiences of color specifically. And so we sort of start there, and we think about what gets franchised, what doesn't. So for example, Black Panther, which the sort of industry discourse around Black Panther was that, generally speaking, that if Black folks didn't show up and see this movie, it was going to destroy the opportunities for big budget Black cast films hereafter. And we've seen that as far back as 1978 with The Wiz. Like, that discourse has sort of been there. But at the same time, the first trailer for Black Panther premiered on the NBA Finals. On the one hand, sure, there are Black folks watching it, but it is also to say that it is sort of this integrated marketing campaign that sort of, on one hand, attempts to hail Black audiences, but understands that Black audiences are actually not the important audience there. And so it is similar to what Fox does in the early 1990s. It is similar to what UPN, the WB and UPN do in the late 1990s. It is similar to what TBS does in the early 2010s ish. It is sort of similar to this kind of discourse that continues to perpetuate itself. So, in other words, if Black fans, for example, and Black folks had a Pavlovian response to show up to Black Panther, and the industry knows that Black folks have a Pavlovian response to being and feeling seen. And so that metric gets exploited. And then when Black Panther succeeded, it succeeded because it was a Marvel film. If Black Panther had failed, it would have been a Black cast film, and we would have sort of paid the representational price for decades to come. And so when we talk about fan discourse and if we talk about sort of fandom as power and voice as power, there is a way that I think fans of color construe themselves as having power, but they also, I think, recognize that they're in a sort of catch-22. So that, for example, I think we're going to pay for The Color Purple, because The Color Purple did not perform as, or it does not break even. And the self-fulfilling prophecy in the industry is also that The Color Purple is a very specific kind of film, so like we don't actually bother with trying to get it distributed internationally so that we can actually sort of rely on those dollars to prop it up and like we can break even. And so there's a way that the alleged industrial specificity, and let's be clear, nobody actually goes out and tries to sell this stuff internationally and like gets the door slammed in their face. They actually just say, oh yeah, like somebody had told me 20 years ago that this thing doesn't work, so I guess it don't work. And so there's a way in which this kind of discourse perpetuates itself, and then Black viewers pay the price for sort of not showing up and showing that they're good consumer citizens, when it was like, we never actually even asked for this in the first place. Because like, I don't know nobody who asked for the movie version of the movie musical film version of The Color Purple, because the stage musical is not that good to begin with. So I don't know who asked for it, but there's a way in which there's a representational price to pay when we get these things, so that when we see A Wrinkle in Time show up, when we see American Fiction show up, when we see The Color Purple show up, there is this innate understanding that Black folks are supposed to see it, even if it was never imagined with us as the primary audience, or what I call in a short essay I wrote, I call it surplus Blackness, where it is about just sort of being able to grab these audiences and exploit their dollars, quite frankly, in a way that doesn't actually specifically hail them, but it does enough to try to get them, but they're actually after somebody else. So it's like Fox was always after young adult males. They were never after Black audiences. They just use hip hop. And so it's that kind of discourse.
Yeah, super helpful, and it resonates with, it seems like, Kristen Werner's concept of plastic representation too, I think.
Yeah, in some ways
yeah.
it's plastic representation. In
Yeah.
other ways, it's actually just, listen, it's just like, who asked for this? It's one, who asked for this. It's two, the rising cost of media production. The ways particularly in television, where sort of this deficit financing model is real strange when we think about like ad revenue, and we think about those kinds of questions. When we think about film, we think about the sort of the way that we are inundated with film, but like there's a way in which we're supposed to sort of be able to like break through all the noise to find this thing. And it is also a fundamental misunderstanding that Black people actually have taste cultures, and that it's not just about representation, and that that Latino folks aren't just like, oh, I'm going to see any old Latino on the screen, and it's like we actually have more than that now. But it is that we get this thing as if we're still in a model of scarcity, where we still have 3 networks and like 2 screens in our local town. And so it works as if this scarcity model is still in operation, where it's just like, we'll throw these folks anything. And we throw these folks anything because they already know that we'll turn away from them the second they stop spending their money on us.
Yeah. So helpful, thank you. So Nitin, I know you've done research on Bollywood, and they're no stranger to sequels and to franchises, and so critical to this history that we're discussing here. So talk a little bit about, my understanding is you're doing some research on the YRF spy universe. So can you tell us a little bit about that franchise and maybe why it stands out among other kind of big budget productions that are coming out of South Asia?
Yeah. I guess I came for Yasraj Chopra. We're going to stay for Below Deck. So we'll see.
We're going to get there.
We're going to get there. But I actually wanted to take the YRF spy franchise, if you don't mind, Marc, as a sort of entry point into some broader sort of global questions.
Please.
Because I think one of the interesting things about studying global Hollywood is how provincial some of its vernacular seems to be. So when we think about franchises in the Hollywood context, they mean, this thing means very different things as we move around the world, and we get to very different forms of retail culture, and the relationship between merchandise and product, etc. And in the Hindi cinema context, which I'll start with, talk a little bit about Hollywood, and then maybe talk about the spy franchise, but I also want to say something about Bahubali, because I think that the South Indian industry is Tollywood, as it's sort of commonly called, is really where it's at when it comes to franchise logic these days. So I'll sort of circle through these things, and we'll see if we'll see where we end up. But I think that when we're talking about franchises, we're basically talking about the relationship between culture and repetition. I'm teaching a seminar on repetition. Some of the repetition kids are here. It's good to see you guys. It feels like we've been in class since Thursday.
Are you repeating yourself?
I am repeating myself. But this is all to the good. If we think about how repetition functions in Hindi cinema, let's say, it's so central to the kind of cultural logic that one doesn't have to necessarily think of a term, or a term like franchise would be relatively impoverished to capture how these sort of cultures co-inhabit certain kinds of spaces. Even thinking of series and sequels, even though we have sequels, right? They function in very different ways. If we think about, so much of Hindi cinema especially is built on a certain kind of foundational connective logic, that it doesn't necessarily need something to be projected onto it to draw those connections. Stardom, for example, is constitutive. We think of the dynastic families. We think of how financing functions. We think about the corporate studios. We think about plots, right? We think about the number of times Shah Rukh Khan has been called Rahul in one of his films, right? So this form of repetition is something that is sort of constant and constitutive. So I think that makes it a very different kind of cultural environment. That's not to say that the franchise logic is not emergent, and I'll end with that in a second. Hollywood is, as in many places, comes in with a certain kind of logic of its own. And in the Indian context, and I've written about this quite a bit, Hollywood was always interested in the Indian market. Obviously, we've got an incredibly cine-literate culture. Film is essential. Hollywood was never able to break through because of how constitutive some of these cultures were. But nevertheless, it tried. So all of these different kinds of films that we think of as franchise films, even going back to the 50s and the 60s, entered into the Indian space and then were just Indianized, right? So there were two versions of Superman alone in 1960, for example, right? So, and we have our own sort of indigenized superheroes that show up, that are superpowered through gods and gadgets, rarely genetics, but if you squint, genetics and mythology is sort of the same thing, right? So the gods and genes are sort of brought together. So there is that tradition, but there was also the sort of force of localization. Hollywood was not happy about that, right? Its plots were constantly being copied, and then the special effects came in, right? And those you can't copy in the same way. Or if you try to copy, it's going to look like a poor imitation. I don't think that the Indian versions of the superhero films, the Superman films, or let's say Mr. India from 1987 was seen as a poor imitation of Hollywood, right? It was ours, right? But once you get films like The Avengers coming in, 2012, you've got multiplexes, you've got digital projection, people are being acclimated to these incredibly high production values, these kinds of franchise aesthetics, for lack of a better term. And those can't be copied, right, in the same way. So I think there was a brief kind of interregnum where Hollywood could breathe a kind of, maybe we've kind of Avengers made a shit ton of money in India. But I think what Hollywood didn't contend with was the fact that, through its kind of global distribution and division of labor when it comes to special effects, right? A lot of the special effects houses were in South Asia as well, and especially in South India, which had been doing sort of cleanup tasks for early Marvel films. We had this distinction between creative tasks and execution tasks. So the creative tasks would be done in the U.S., and the kind of cleanup work, the execution tasks would be done overseas. And a lot of India played a big role in this kind of special effects boom that helped breathe life into the franchise logic. But then we started making our own films, leveraging the kinds of creative capacity that were housed in these special effects houses to start driving the logic. And this is happening in China as well, for example, right? So some people may have seen I can't remember where this was in the New York Times, but I think the last year was the first year in 10 years that a Hollywood film was not in the top 10 of the Chinese box office, right? And what was it replaced with were high budget, high production value Chinese films, Wandering Earth, etc., speaking of a franchise, right? These incredible, and these are all traveling as well. Films that, you don't need, Hollywood is not the only player in town when it comes to the franchise aesthetic. So a lot of this is happening in China, it's happening in India. I'll say something quickly about the Yasraj spy universe, which is kind of an accidental franchise. And it's very much part, Yasraj Chopra is a very well-known, I know we've got aficionados in the room, but for those who don't know the history of Hindi cinema was a kind of very important director when it comes to romance and melodrama in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Had a brief foray into action films in the 1980s, and then that film did not do well, and he thought, why don't I cast Sridevi in some of my films? And then, of course, Sridevi was going to bring the romance genre back. And there's a really interesting documentary on Netflix called The Romantics that you can look back and see kind of the history of Yash Raj Studio. So it's a studio, once the corporate logic started coming into India in the 1990s, it sort of rationalized its production, etc. And once sort of Yash Raj, the patriarch, kind of moved to the side, that's when we saw different genres coming into play. So the action film then emerged again. So the Yash Raj spy universe is an action genre. It has a number of films that are really predicated on leveraging the star power of particular stars, right? So the Tiger films, for example, 1, 2, and 3, are all about Salman Khan's popularity, right? The war films 1 and soon 2 are about Hrithik Roshan's star text. And Pathan, of course, is about Shah Rukh, right? And then they start appearing after you get to the second or third film in the Yash Raj sort of genealogy. They start appearing in each other's films. And that's where the universe starts to get built. But it's really crossover stardom. Right, and so the idea of the franchise is a little different. I mean, they're all, a lot of them are working in the research and analysis wing of the Indian intelligence service. So that's a bit like Bond, right? The way that Jennifer was talking about Bond, and there's kind of the espionage logic, and obviously that has a kind of franchise aesthetic. Think about Mission Impossible as well. But I don't think of that as much a part of the way we think about franchises more generally. That's, in some ways, just a new take on how to leverage stardom, and especially aging stardom, right? To put it politely, because we're obviously all aging, but not Shah Rukh. So there's that logic. But really where the franchise logic is happening in a way that's recognizable to probably many of us in the room is in the Bahubali franchise. Many of you probably are familiar with S.S. Rajamouli. If you don't know the name, everyone saw RRR, right? But actually, for our intents and purposes in thinking about franchises, Bahubali is the more interesting and more intriguing case. And the reason why goes back to what Jennifer and I called you Jennifer. I haven't called you Jennifer in decades. What Jen and Courtney were talking about when it comes to IP and brand logics. So Rajamouli, in his wisdom with his production company, as they were thinking about how to come up with this idea, right, worked with a brand licensing company. So merchandising was built in. So they contracted this firm that's based in Mumbai called Black, White, and Orange. And this firm had been the licensing partner for many Hollywood franchises up to that point. So the Minions franchise, a lot of toy merchandising. They had done stuff for Peanuts. They had done stuff for Game of Thrones was their big one, right? So the merchandising, the apparel merchandising for Game of Thrones that BWO did netted, these guys $40-50 million, a big country. So they worked with BWO and said, what we're interested in thinking about our franchise is a consistent and coherent visual design that we can then leverage across video games, across merchandise. So it's not so much about leveraging the possibilities of product placement, etc. It's bringing in the brand consultant at the top end to think about consistency of visual design, because that's what's going to compete with Hollywood, right? And obviously, when the BWO, who had worked with studios for maybe not decades, but many, many years, they had no role in thinking about Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones came in and said, we want you to do this, make it happen. They had no again, that split between creativity and execution. They had no say in the creative logic. What can we do to Indianize Game of Thrones, right? What can we do to make Peanuts appeal to Indian kids? No, you're just going to sell the same iconography. So there was no shift. So once Rajamouli and his partners asked BWO to come up with a consistent visual design, they jumped, right? So they parlayed this to thinking about, and if you've seen, everyone must watch Bahubali tonight. We should do a screening in here. It'd be fantastic,
Yeah.
right? But so much of that film, sort of, there are moments where it steps back, and you can kind of see a visual logic being inculcated that's going to drive, okay, that looks like a video game background, right? That looks like the world of the novel. It's now Bahubali, I think it's animated series, now in 4 seasons, right? It's a series of novels, graphic novels, and obviously the merchandising. So to bring that sort of story full circle, it is still very much about branding and licensing, but bringing in those partners in when it comes to visual design and creative story execution rather than on the back end to say, well, what can we do with this finished product and how can we market it? So I think it's one of those cases where some of the logics as we understand them in Hollywood get turned on their head.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And thinking about the spy universe and this kind of like aging stardom, aging franchise also reminds me of Sex and the City, and just like that.
Or John Wick.
What's that?
Or John Wick.
Yeah.
Or John Wick. Yeah, all of these exactly. And so there's something actually to there could be some interesting writing or thinking on the aging franchise and the aging stars.
Mission Impossible.
Mission Impossible, and of course that's a franchise that is in is right now at risk of not continuing. But so JD, we've been kind of alluding to finance and investment, so you need to take us home with this. So let's discuss the role of financing, and I'm thinking particularly here of debt financing. My understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected, and things to be clarified for all of us, is that sort of Netflix pioneered this sort of method, to massively invest in growing one's catalog on your streaming platform, and even if it puts one in further debt, is the kind of point, but that will increase the overall value of the company in time. So these older studios have adopted and seem to have adapted this model as well, and now we're seeing obviously them cutting back, and the kind of bubble is bursting or has burst. So I'm wondering if there's a direct linkage or correlation between this move towards debt financing and the proliferation of franchises as we see them today, and if not, what is the dominant financial strategy of these franchises, and both when they start and as they continue to grow?
So the bubble has burst.
The bubble has
saw
burst.
it burst over and over and over again last summer. Right?
Okay.
So even when you looked at the successes, say, Mario and Barbie, pre-existing IP, but no pre-existing franchises. Those are the ones that do well over $1 billion globally. But Indiana Jones, Mission Impossible, just one disappointment after another.
Yeah.
As far as the overall model, one of the things that Netflix believed was that by getting out in front of this, they would then be able to drastically lower their debt before it crippled them. And they did. Netflix has about $14 billion worth of debt right now. Little Paramount has 15. Like, that's just a devastating difference.
Yeah.
Warner Brothers Discovery has triple that. It's harder to judge compared to some of the other studios because they have huge capital expenditures, because they're real estate firms if they're Disney, or they're hardwire firms if it's NBC Universal. But those have 3 times, they have roughly that same kind of debt going there. For a long time that didn't matter, and I don't think people quite have gotten to the point where we can realize that after the early 1980s, money is essentially free, right? Interest rates are incredibly low, and there's no inflation. So your actual time horizon can stretch out forever, because the dollar you spend today is not worth $1.50 because of inflation later on, or vice versa. The dollar that you make in 3 years is not meaningfully less. That all comes completely apart after the pandemic, sort of bubble bursts there. And so now your year-over-year debt costs have tripled. Immediately your time horizon shortens, right? So if you think about what the results of that initial endlessness were. It was slates that you could plan for 10 years. It was the assumption that you could build audiences into the same thing over and over and over again. And it was tremendously successful. That, we get to that point where, after 20 movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it pays off. And because things had been working quite well up until that point, you think about the Batman series, the Harry Potter series, which we haven't mentioned, because things have been working that well, the value of intangible assets, of IP, in order to secure your financing had become an ordinary part of the business. So when Marvel becomes, when it's an independent, before it gets bought by Disney, and it's trying to figure out how to bootstrap itself into being a studio, they borrow about $500 million from Merrill Lynch. They don't have to worry about that paying off. But if all of the movies flopped, what they pledged as collateral was 10 superheroes. They didn't pledge Kevin Feige's car. It wasn't like when, it wasn't like when Francis Ford Coppola said, "You can have my vineyard if Apocalypse Now tanks." Yeah. There's not a real asset. The assets are intangible, and part of the reason that was plausible to Merrill Lynch was not because they believed that Thor was profitable. No one thought Thor was profitable. The reason it was, but nobody thought so except Kevin. But the reason that they believed it was that if it didn't work, they could just hold the asset, and at some point it would be worth something because it wasn't being degraded by inflation. Mm-hmm. So that's this model. Then you take a kind of, and I started talking just pure macro terms about this, but there's also a gargantuan amount of retirement funding out there desperately looking for return. Right? These are people who have been making 1% in savings. And all of that money is then being managed into kind of big piles to try to find return, wherever that might be. And so ordinary investors are not buying $10,000 shares of a Walt Disney movie like in the 1980s. They are in huge private equity kind of led mutual funds or whatever that are out there looking to try to find return. So there's a lot more money going into the sector because it looks like it's a place that might offer, more than standard returns. Mm-hmm. So money is easy, money is cheap, time horizons are very long, and the industrial structure, to get back to this, looks like it's stable. It has this fairly consistent waterfall of funding over time, and that waterfall is lovely for you. Now just break every piece of that. There's no more waterfall because Netflix has destroyed it. The time horizon has shortened because of inflation and high interest rates. And now you can start to think about some of these creative exhaustion kinds of problems that we've started to see as not only the exhaustion of what does Kevin Feige do for his 25th Marvel movie, or what is the 5th Indiana Jones movie, and those are real creative problems, but they're also problems where the speed with which you need to keep the flywheel going is something that you don't have the chance to course correct on in the same way. So where we are right now, we're watching Warner Brothers Discovery do unthinkable things like cancel, finished movies. I hope that you all go back and watch David Zaslav's astonishing earnings call when he sort of comes out and announces what the plans are for the next decade. It's just an incredible fantasy of what they might do, including remake all the Harry Potter stuff, right? They had just strip mined the Harry Potter things through Fantastic Beasts into lack of they made it a money losing proposition, and they're like, no, we're going to redo it. These are kind of amazing things. And it's a mark of the distinction between where they are and where the franchise model will carry you forward. One last sort of example here, because if it's obvious that the legacy studios have issues, and it's interesting when the streamers do, you mentioned Citadel, Jen. I love that. That thing is a disaster.
I love it.
You can learn more about that. But the Citadel problem is basically, if you thought that what people wanted was just narrative complexity, then we'll give you a lot of that, even if it doesn't have any logic to it. It's exactly the opposite of the opportunistic cleverness of the spy universe, because they're like, we're going to have a spy universe from the get-go, and it didn't work. Anyway, it's an amazing story. But I'm interested in sort of other offshoot examples, and I will talk about Lionsgate here a little bit. When we were putting this panel together, one of the people I wanted to come was the head of Lionsgate's film division, and he has since been relieved of those responsibilities. Lionsgate has notoriously been for sale for a couple of years, getting ready to sell itself. It has the Starz premium channel, and then it's a mid-major studio. And if you think back to 2023, Lionsgate pumped one of each of its franchises back into the theaters in order to get it ready to have intangible assets that would be worth something. So we had a John Wick, but we also had Hunger Games, and we had an Expendables, and the Expendables, of course, didn't work, and the Hunger Games did, and the John Wick really did, but it was an assumption that franchises would be the intangible assets that you could use to mortgage a future valuation or that you could use to attract a buyer who would want to buy the whole thing. And this is the end of that. Right? Now, as it happens, interest rates are going to go down, inflation has come back down, but I don't think we're getting the gang back together again. I think that too much narrative exhaustion has happened, too much fan uprising and sort of like disarticulation has happened for us to go back to the heady days of 2012 or 2015 or something like that. But it's these macro changes that have really transformed the temporality of franchise making and transformed how much freedom to play there has been or will be going forward.
Does anyone want to respond to anyone's points or to what JD's just laid out? Or we can also listen to Nitin talk about Below Deck. But where do folks want to go from here?
I'm liking the connections between what Al said and what JD is talking about too. And if you think about, even if we haven't talked about hedge funds really, or that kind of financing, but who's running those institutions and organizations and how they're funding production and franchising. I think it's interesting when we're all coming from all these different directions, how it just kind of does
dovetail.
It does help these different perspectives make sense.
I mean, I think part of what is sort of the theme here is how difficult this business is, in the sense that audiences actually have no clue what they actually want. So if we think about, for example, Felicia Henderson has an essay that she wrote about, I think it might be South Central, but I might be making it up. But anyway, she did this sort of ethnographic study of South Central, this show that ran for a season in the 90s on Fox. And the creators of South Central went into South Central LA, and they gathered focus groups, and the focus groups told them what they wanted, and the writers went back and they wrote it, and then they showed it to the people, and they were like, yeah, but not like that, sis. And so and then South Central happens and it tanks, and so there's this really sort of weird thing in which audiences tell you what they want, and then you're like, here you go, and they're like, yeah, but not like that. And so there's this sort of attempt to capture lightning in a bottle, and I think that that's partly what this this cycle of franchising, of spin-offs, of revivals, of reboots is about. Is it's like, well, listen, at least we know that y'all told us y'all like this one thing. And so, let's just keep producing it until y'all tell us you don't want it anymore. And so, there's a way that I hate everything about that. But then there's also a way that I'm like, yeah, I understand, because people are illogical. And I think that's really and again, as we sort of think about these financing models, as we think about how much debt these companies, and let's also be clear, we're not about to cry for any of these companies, but the fact that they are going into this much debt, trying to give us something, is really sort of part of the story, is that they're giving us this stuff and they don't know if we want it. And even if they did the research, we tell them we wanted it and we might not. And so there's a way that it's sort of like franchising and reboots and all of that makes sense. And it makes sense that, Hairspray starts as a film and then it becomes a musical and then we make a musical out of the film and then we have all of this calculus and it all makes sense in some ways, even in its nonsensicalness.
Yeah, I like what Nitin said about franchises are about culture and repetition, and it seems like what you're describing to an extent is that repetition is both an asset, obviously, and also a risk.
Yeah,
and it's hard for them to sometimes the studios or the execs to see, to be able to parse that out. But were you going to say something to that, JV, or just?
No, I was just going to say that's exactly like the kind of when we talk about fatigue.
Yeah.
Right. The fatigue is not a fatigue at the witnessing of high quality production values.
Right.
In fact, it's narrative fatigue in general, and sometimes it's star fatigue as well. But that kind of fatigue, then Marvel has failed to get past this, but it certainly has tried to think through that. And in a series like She-Hulk, like what does it mean, like to sort of try to make fun of the way all these Marvel shows end. But yeah, what is it that you people want? And the flip side of that, and this. Not to tout She-Hulk, but it does get you to the point where it's clear that the writer's room has no power there, right? That's the way that.
Right.
So it's not about the creativity failing; it's about giving you the same thing has failed. And you mentioned South Central, so I just immediately was thinking of South Side, the TV show, which I love because it's. I don't know, to get back to your who wanted this, I don't know who wanted it except the people who made it, and it turned out that I did.
Yeah.
It turned out that a lot of other people did, and they got to make the thing that they wanted to make for a while.
Yeah.
And I think that's, there tends to be less fatigue if the person's creativity is really on the line sometimes. Not that was going to be a franchise. For those of you who've not seen it, it's truly odd.
I mean, and the other thing that I would add in here is that there's the logic of the franchise, the logic of the revival, the logic of the reboot makes sense in this incredibly diffuse media environment, in this incredibly noisy world in which we live, because something's got to break through. And in some ways, like the sort of the simple answer is the thing that's going to break through is that thing that broke through the last time. So like here's, Throw Mama from the Train Part 3, which I would actually I might actually watch that out of morbid curiosity. I also just aged myself, but that's all right. But I think there's a way that logic is it makes sense even as I shake my fist at the sun like an old man about it, because of all of the things that are streaming at this point, what is, and we could only ever pretend this to be sure, but what is a TV culture? What is a film culture? Yeah. Part of why I think ratings for the Emmys and the Golden Globes and the Oscars are generally down is because we can no longer pretend that there is a film, an American film culture or an American television culture. And so, even as I broadly study media, I don't watch the award shows because all the stuff that gets, I also don't watch quality stuff either because it's boring. But none of the stuff I watch is generally nominated for anything. So it's what do I need to watch? I've never heard of these things, and I'm probably not going to watch it anyway.
Can I pick up on this? A couple of folks have been talking about fatigue and exhaustion, but maybe we can talk about pleasure as well. And I remember when we had the call to let's talk about franchises, and Jen said, "Well, what about TV?" Right? Yeah. And Jen and I had coffee beforehand, and she was talking about her love of Real Housewives, and I was talking, of course, about Below Deck.
I'm not sorry.
Yeah, sorry, not sorry. And I was talking, of course, about Below Deck. And so I wonder, and this is a question that all of us, I think, are interested in, broadly speaking, as cultural critics. what form of repetition is it in the Marvel universe that has created fatigue, but yet in the Below Deck and in the Real Housewives universe has created ongoing pleasure? And one of the answers might be how seriality functions across the different media, right? So if you think about seriality in film and seriality as essential to television, and then back to that question of, JD, you talk about the writer's room, right? Well, that's neatly circumvented in the Below Deck and in the Real Housewives, because you don't need
have a writer's room.
You don't have writers' room. So again,
They
in terms of the
don't?
no, they do. But in terms of how,
shifting.
no, very true. But in terms of one thinks about what one watches these shows for, you're gonna get the same thing. And here I'm going to talk about Below Deck. You're gonna get bad behavior. You're going to get drunkenness. You're going to get insubordination. You're going to get sexual harassment, right? Those are the things that one returns to over and over again. But then you're going to get these tiny minor variations that people can kind of glom onto. And that's what, one finds fulfilling. We were talking about, what's the difference between Real Housewives of Salt Lake? And sorry, Devin, I'm not going to ask you to tell us what is the difference between. Devin knows that culture really well, but the difference between Real Housewives of Salt Lake and Real Housewives of Miami or.
Oh my God, everything.
Sure. Well, say.
I mean, there are those of us who are housewives fans. It's like you have your franchises that you watch, and then you have your franchises that you would rather die than watch.
So within the Real Housewives, there's
individual hierarchies. Like my hierarchy
Right.
is not everybody's, but it's I can only watch so much,
Right.
and so I can't watch every. So I pick it by how insane they are, and the most insane is Salt Lake City, the most, and then Jersey. And then Beverly Hills.
Crazy?
What?
Salt Lake City is crazy?
The most crazy.
Oh, you haven't heard about all this?
The
No,
most
because
crazy.
I mean, not out of any sort of
but
like.
I mean that,
ooh, I don't
and
mind
that's
it.
an interesting way to think about it. And then I'm also, when you're mentioning pleasure and the things you can expect, I'm thinking of the Bachelor franchise too, which I proudly watch in all of its iterations, and the Bachelor and the Bachelorette and the Golden Bachelor, which should not be ignored. It is a phenomenal example of what you get it no matter what the tweaks are. You get the crying. These women are 75 years old, crying hysterically because he didn't pick them. And it's the 20-year-olds do it and the 75-year-olds do it. It's completely fascinating. You have creepy bachelors or slutty whatever contestants, it's all there in just the whole format. It doesn't matter, and that, I guess, gives us a lot of pleasure.
It's interesting you talked about the hierarchy, because then some of the pleasure is watching the kind of down market version and comparing that to the up market version. But this is the reason that Below Deck is the best. Because we have no hierarchy.
You don't?
Universe. No.
You don't think Sailing Yacht is worse?
No, because Sailing Yacht, when you turn off the engines and the sails come up and the boat tilts 30 degrees and the camera moves out, is incredibly fulfilling. Right? It's just a sublime moment, right? So that provides that pleasure. And you don't get that in Below Deck Adventure. You don't get that. But you get Norway and fjords, right? You don't get that in Below Deck Mediterranean, but you get kind of Italian nuttiness, right? So I think it's interesting because when we throw this out to the audience, I think there are these franchises where some folks are completionists and may watch everything, and then some folks may align themselves with certain iterations of the franchise. Same thing happens with Marvel movies.
And Drag Race.
Yeah, I was going to.
Yeah,
Drag
Actual
Race.
franchise
Yeah.
of Drag Race too. Yeah.
Well, I'd say going back to the idea of hierarchy, if you want to talk about the Housewives, and it's who gets the spinoff, who gets multiple spinoffs, who's able to monetize this into restaurants or a food chain or whatever, clothes, whatever. I was thinking about Love Is Blind on Netflix, and so like thinking about, you mentioned international formats, and that's something, you know, in terms of the hierarchy there, or just in terms of like what does that look like when there's an international format that's then remade, all these, you know, Survivor, whatever, we could go through a million. Top Chef. I'm a big Top Chef fan. And then what does that look like in these different, because the same thing happens, the crying and the fighting and the the disappointment.
I mean, I also think what's interesting about these sort of franchised or formatted docu-series is that usually it's the ones who can give good soundbite.
Yeah.
That is the, like, again, like if we talk about sort of breaking through the clutter, like, you know, and again, this is not like, ooh, I don't watch this stuff. I just haven't watched it. But like, I haven't really watched Real Housewives of Atlanta. But like, I know lots of Nene-isms. And listen, I also know that money cannot buy you class. And so it's like the ways that these things sort of like move out of the franchise. That is also sort of a way of making them resonant in a way that keeps them going on for so long.
Yeah, and to add to this list, I think that this has elicited a kind of pleasure, when you're talking about pleasure, the pleasure of hating it, which is really psychotic, that our entire culture has developed around hate watching, and that becomes pleasurable, and that's so animated by these franchises that sometimes I watch the ones I hate the most because I have the most fun, which is really a strange thing that I don't know if it seems more limited to TV just because of, I guess, the context in which we are experiencing them. I'm not going to march out to the theater and hate something.
That's what I was going to ask. Marvel, people aren't really going and hate watching 3-hour Marvel.
Yeah, like, because in some ways,
no, they did not. That is what happened in 2023, right? Is
Yeah.
that people stopped hate watching Marvel.
Right.
If they ever, or if they never started. Sorry.
Did you want to wrap up? Sorry, what you were saying? Or
No,
okay.
I mean, JD was trying to get a word in,
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
we went off on the housewives.
It seems to happen all the time. Yeah.
No, look, I watch Citadel, I watch Foundation, I cannot wait.
Oh, you were the one person who
watched this Masters of the Air, like, that's $300 million on fire, right? Like, cannot wait. And so, it's not, in that case, it's not hate watching, as just like, yeah, man, let's do this. But I want to get to some of the actual.
It's like the Fire Festival of franchises, basically.
Yeah, it's like they made Austin Butler a star miraculously in the Elvis thing, and now they're gonna just turn him to dust. It won't affect him because it's on Apple and no one will have seen it. Alas, there's some great stuff over there. That's where Slow Horses is, right? So, but when it comes to franchise pleasure, I think that there was like just a wild kind of like misprision that the narrative brilliance that the Marvel people managed to like successfully accomplish, that you would want to go do 20 movies in a row for this payoff, was the thing that was pleasurable, that like massive amount of narrative complication was it. And it's clear now with all of the TV series that just now feels like homework to even many of the people who liked those movies.
Overwhelming.
And this is why the Russo brothers' Citadel is kind of a disaster, because it presumed that the pleasure lay there, as opposed to Robert Downey Jr. is a very charismatic person, and I would like to watch him periodically in movies, right? And yes, I watched him in all the Iron Man movies, and then I watched him be a real jerk in Oppenheimer, but it was the same kind of like star pleasure. And so I think that some of these older pleasures were far more consistent, and that they were just sort of hidden underneath the artifice, the edifice of this gargantuan narrative complication. The flip side of that would be, if you were to look at the DC version, where so much of DC has been a disaster. They know this. They fired all the people involved in it. They brought in, they brought in James Gunn and Peter Safran to try to fix that. But the parts they're not going to fix are, the part that was the Batman and the Joker, which are independent continuities functioning on their own. Which, if you were a comic person, you might say we've achieved a new kind of spectatorship where people are willing to accept multiple independent character continuities at the same time.
Yeah.
The way that when you walk into a comic book shop, there's this run and that run and that run.
Right.
And if you thought that it was the narrative thing that you liked, this is an amazing achievement. Not obviously at the scale of the MCU, but something like that. Maybe people just really like Robert Pattinson, and they really liked him a lot in these other movies, and they like him kind of in these indie movies, and now he's back in a great big movie, and so we like him. So I do think that part of what I'm calling franchise fatigue was an attempt to try to make narrative complexity match the massive need for like regular return on capital allocation, when in fact a lot of what we were seeing was people finding new fandoms or finding new attachments or holding on to very traditional kinds. Those could be stars, those could be locales, those could be maybe James Bond as a character, but it wasn't necessarily, let's watch 50 different movies collapse into one another and and do that.
Yeah. When it's not even world building, it's universe building, and when it's just too expansive and too, as you said, intricate and complicated for people to actually want to keep showing up for it.
And it's much cheaper if you do that in an animated world or if you do that in a set of novels or whatever. Like in a novel, you can say, "Alas, the city was destroyed." That's like one sentence, and then they're like, "Okay, so we got to destroy New York. Like first, let's get 5,000 people in India ready to go do the finish work on this." And yeah, that's right.
I think it might be a good moment to open it up if folks have questions or responses. Titles we haven't, or IP we haven't talked about yet. Guilty pleasures. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about how streaming somewhat complicates the accessibility for fans to interact with franchises. Most recently, RuPaul's Drag Race Season 16 is a Viacom, but not available to stream anywhere. In this age where it's kind of the push to watch next day on Peacock, and it's a big push for that. But still, there's this kind of, resistance to moving certain legacy properties onto streaming. How does it complicate the future of franchising these cross-generationally?
That's a great question. And a lot of that's about licensing and what gets available depending on what, platform, et cetera. And what's taken down, too, as we saw with, was it Max, right? They took a lot of stuff down.
Yeah. I'll say a couple things, but I really want to hear what other people say. Like we just got Moonlight back, Moonlight, because they finally cleared all those music rights. So Northern Exposure was notoriously impossible to stream, and so somebody has to go do all of that relicensing work for those older properties. That's not the case with RuPaul's Drag Race, but the sort of some of the. When you don't have those things available, like Mad About You was not available to stream when the reboot came out. It's like, well, that's about as stupid a move as you can imagine. Like I don't claim to be like somebody who could be a producer, but I wouldn't have this new one without the old one there. Right? I wouldn't do the new Frasier without the old Frasier. So of course, it does complicate it, but I think some of the decisions are obvious, and I don't know why like a gap like that would be allowed to persist.
I mean, what I will say particularly about Drag Race is that one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about Drag Race and its sort of lack of availability streaming is that there's a way that I think, and I sort of generally do this as well, is that like now I actually go out and watch it. And so there's a way, like there's a kind of interesting way that there's a kind of reversion to like some like older models of spectatorship that I think is actually kind of interesting for because, and I will also say this, like I watch Drag Race very differently in a bar because I actually have to watch the whole thing versus like if I'm at home, I watch 10 minutes at the beginning and then I go to the runway because like people and their personalities, which is why I don't watch a whole lot of reality TV, people and their personalities just get on my nerves because I'm just a little too old for like that kind of drama. And so, but there's a way that there's a kind of pleasure in sort of watching it in public that I don't actually necessarily get when I'm watching it at home, just me and my husband. And so So I think that there's something that's interesting about that. But what the other thing that I will also say is that one of the things that, and RuPaul is generally a terrible human, but one of the things that is amazing about RuPaul and sort of the way that Ru can exercise power is that back in the dark ages when like they were still shooting with Vaseline on the camera lens, when they would say, "Ooh, girl, you got shemale," and Glad and somebody else was on their butts. Oh, it was Glad and it was Logo, was on their butts about like not saying the term, and RuPaul said either in a tweet or in an interview, like, y'all are not going to tell me what to do as long as I keep the lights on over there. And then shortly thereafter, because Ru was already in Viacom, then like RuPaul's Drag Race moved to VH1 under the logic that Logo could not actually simulcast in HD. And then all of a sudden, it moved to VH1, and then like the lights started dimming over at Logo. And then it moved onto MTV, where now I think now is where it sort of plays, and then it streams the next day. And so there's a really kind of interesting way that I think power sort of functions here as well. And my hunch is that it probably has something to do with RuPaul making money somehow. So listen, I don't know if it's on like World of Wonder or something where RuPaul is getting more of a cut. In addition to the fracking money Ru makes, but I imagine that there's, because listen, if RuPaul, there is one thing that we always know about RuPaul. RuPaul is gonna get that, like every penny out of that check that is coming, and so my hunch is that there's probably something financial about it.
Well, and also, these things kind of all relate. Now that every company has decided to have their own direct-to-consumer service, right? Who wants to pay for 10 services to run after every franchise and to keep track of where they're going to be? And
they keep moving, right?
They keep moving based on these whatever power machinations or based on new services that are being developed to keep things in-house. And I feel like that's, this kind of fragmentation. Part of franchise fatigue is an overwhelming amount of these things. And the overwhelming amount of services that we have to deal with to find them is fragmenting the audience to the point where I don't know how... it's fragmenting the audience to the point that it's creating more problems also for those that have been successful. And we're kind of longing for the days of when we can just find everything, when the studios were giving everything to Netflix. Kind of like how we're longing for the days where if you could just tote around a thing that has all the news in it and then read it when you want. We don't have that anymore. And so maybe... I feel the same way about all of these new services. I'm going broke paying for all of them. I feel like I have to have all of them, and it's my job, and I can write it off and whatever, but it's still incredibly annoying and confusing, and I don't know how to find anything anyway.
I mean, also the gag is that the reason that most of us went to Netflix in the first place was because cable is more expensive, and we sat
we all
up
cut
and
that cord.
we let the industry recreate cable. And we are now paying the price for it. And so, we were all saying, oh, I'm paying $100 and blah 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 for my cable service. And it's like, well, give Hulu $50 and give this person $15 and give this person $10, and there you go. And they have just recreated cable, and we now just have to figure out where to find things instead of just being like, listen, it's on MTV. And I'm going to MTV, but it's like, well, which MTV is it on? Is it on? Is it over here? Is it over there? And we are thanking them with our paychecks to recreate cable and tell us it's something new.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, these dynamics often seem like opposing forces. So you've got on the one hand so much television that's available, right? And then on the other hand, so much television that is not available, right? You've got these enormous holes like the 80s or the 90s that are just missing. You've got the logic of the franchise that seems to be predicated on plenitude,
Yes.
right? And a kind of maximalist approach to narrative availability. But at the same time, it's predicated on something that's incredibly singular, like what was Jonathan Majors doing, right? So I think that wrecks like one person and one person's sort of fundamentally wrecks the future of the MCU, right? Or not, but yet at least the way we think about it, like how much is available in terms of the Marvel Universe for stories to tell, right? We're retelling those stories, Secret Wars is coming up, we're retelling all those stories from the 80s, etc. But yet the investment and to leverage on a singular, and doesn't Hollywood know, right? That you can't rely on anybody to carry this thing, right? In terms of like a singular...
If we wind back to that utopian moment when they greenlight Guardians of the Galaxy, a franchise within the franchise that had nothing that anyone knew about. We've got a genetic mutant raccoon, and like these are all kind of semi-loser characters, and James Gunn's like, no, I can make this work, and they're like, okay, and that was a plausible decision, but the idea that was $1 billion plausible decision. And so they, then somebody looked at the Marvel list and they're like, there's 3,000 of these characters? That's incredible. But the flip side is that, no, eventually, like, it doesn't always work. You don't have that kind of, it's tough. It's not just
Yeah. I don't know who had their hand up first. We'll go here and then back there. Yeah.
Thinking about how franchise is sort of like meaningless now, as you said, or like it means nothing and everything. I was thinking about sort of like what is the fringe definition of franchising, and my mind was mostly at like A24 as vibe curation and like sort of reiteration rather than franchising, like a shift towards like sort of the same like deeply personal stories being told again and again, but like as like a company like pushing this model of like luxury filmmaking that comes with clothing lines or nice collectibles, right? And then like that expanding into stuff like books, Neon, or even like Mubi has those blue totes that they bring to USC that are really nice. But yeah, like sort of, is that worth talking about as franchising?
I mean, it's certainly branding.
Yeah, it's definitely branding.
And it's branding independent of genre, which is what like the MCU said it was going to do. That comic books are not a genre. Comic books are just like a source for lots of genres. But A24 has been subject to this logic because, and we haven't talked really about private equity. Jen and I have read Andrew DeWard's book. I don't know if you've
fabulous.
It's going to really, really shake things up. But the A24 like movement from 10 to 15 to $20 million movies to movies that are twice that, 2.5 times that, which is now underway, as a result of massive pressure from its private equity investors and so on. So the brand that we know ain't going to be the brand that's there in 3 years because it's just going to be in a different part of the marketplace. So if it's a franchise, it's one like when the Thomas Jane Punisher got turned into the Ray Winstone Punisher. Sorry. But it's a kind of upscaling that's going to happen over there.
I'd also add that franchising's not, franchising exists in the independent spaces of filmmaking, right? Like, one of my favorites, Richard Linklater's Before Sunrise, trilogy. What does that look like as a franchise? And also over time, right, meeting these two people, like, in different decades of their lives. Thinking about, I was thinking about, like, the Evil Dead series, right, like, early on, right? Like, so thinking about that type of franchising and I don't know where it's going to go with this. But, I'm always just, like, not just Hollywood, not just the studios, like, not just, like, in these legacy studios. What does that look like? I don't know if y'all have any other examples we could think of, like, in terms of independent, but... that kind of how the logic sits differently or is the same, but how that is differentiated operates differently, maybe.
Were you going to respond, Al, or you're still
Well, I mean,
thinking about it? Yeah.
I'm kind of sort of thinking about it because, I mean, I think there's also something to, because I am endlessly fascinated by the Disneyfication of Times Square.
Yeah.
And I mean that quite literally in the sense that The Lion King was like the sort of origin text, if we sort of keep the franchising language in some ways, the origin text for the amount of money that was pumped into Times Square to clean it up, and the ways that there was sort of this this continued exercising of intellectual property to sort of say like, yeah, okay, so we do this film that is extraordinarily successful, and then we do a musical that is extraordinarily successful, and then we do another film version. I don't think that one, the one with Donald Glover and Beyonce, I don't think that one did that well, but like.
Live action. I should add that to add live action remakes to the list. Refurbishments. Add it to the
Like
list.
it wasn't like Blockbuster, but it probably broke even. Okay, so listen. So it broke even.
$1.5 billion.
I'm sorry. Say that again.
$1.45 billion.
Jesus, Lord in heaven. Wait. Who saw that? Oh my God!
Okay.
As many people who saw Terminator Dark Fate.
Okay.
That is, listen, I am like color me fascinated. But anyway, but there's a way in which there's, so on one hand we think about franchising in one way and sort of in some ways the expansion of a universe, but there's also this sort of weird way in which these sort of texts sort of do all these different kinds of iterations for different kinds of audiences. And like the fact that like you still can't find a Lion King ticket on the TKTS board in New York is astonishing. And that this kind of intellectual property is behind The Little Mermaid, is behind. There's some I can't remember. I think it might be in San Diego at La Jolla, but there is literally a Mystic Pizza the musical happening. And so there's a way that all of and then if it's successul, get ready because there's a Wicked movie coming in 2 parts for some unforsaken reason. But there's a way that this stuff just sort of keeps sort of moving into these different spaces in a way to sort of capitalize on new audiences.
We haven't even talked about theme parks, immersive experiences.
Yeah.
And we haven't talked about any of that. That's a whole nother.
It's just so fascinating to me. Yeah.
And Taylor Swift.
As a franchise.
Yes.
And the two-parter is interesting phenomenon too. I mean, it worked for Dune, but doesn't seem to be working for Dead Reckoning. So it's interesting. That's also an interesting game.
And listen, nobody wants to see Ariana Grande and what's her face in a movie.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I will take that.
Cynthia Erivo.
We only have 10 minutes left, so let's get. We've got, I think, 4 more questions here. So yeah, go ahead.
Mine actually connects back to Taylor Swift, so that's great.
As
many would expect.
He was a plant.
I think this discourse around repetition is really interesting, especially when thinking about repetition and forgetfulness. And specifically, I guess this is kind of directed a little bit more towards Courtney, but I'd love to hear anyone's answers here too. But within the value gap, you talk about this idea of the amnesia cycle.
Amnesia loop. Aw, thank you.
Yeah,
I was thinking about that when you were talking about audiences, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think it's so interesting that as a case study, you look at Wonder Woman and how that should have led to female-directed, female-led, female demographic kind of targeted tentpoles, and yet it didn't. And I think it's really interesting to think about this past year, 2023, and how there's this discourse around kind of female demographics driving huge profits, whether that's in the Eras Tour movie, the Renaissance Tour movie, or Barbie. Do you think that that's just going to be forgotten? What do you kind of see as the future for repetition in terms of female-driven film?
Yeah, I have so many feelings about this. So I'll just kind of summarize. So a chapter of my book talks about distribution marketing of female-driven films and how there's this cycle of something does really well, whether it's Wonder Woman, whether it's Twilight. Wow, it does really well. Wow, women go to the movies. There's this kind of discourse cycle. This is going to change everything. This is going to lead to more women being hired, more female-driven movies. And then it's quickly kind of just swept in back to the status quo, and nothing really changes. And so, I looked at the Wonder Woman cycle, and I was thinking about that Wonder Woman, which also kind of felt different a bit from the ones that came before it in the DCEU, that was successful the first round. And I think a lot of what JD was saying, what happened with the rush and the push, the rush to get the second one out, it was bad. And
great trailer, bad movie.
Bad. and it was pushed, and also, what's going on with COVID, what's going on with them trying to launch the artist formerly known as HBO Max, and how it was like sacrificed to this. What happened with Black Widow being kind of released on during this moment on Disney Plus, and a number of other kind of female-directed or female-driven targeted movies. So in terms of I've been thinking about that a lot. Like, how do we think about Barbie? How do we think about Barbie as a franchise? How do we think about what they're doing with Mattel, with what Mattel Films is now doing by taking all of this, listing the IP? When I was reading an article a month ago, about now there's the plans for the American Girl dolls, and so as a geriatric millennial, the American Girl, I had the Molly doll. I love my Molly doll. The fact that they're now looking at that as the next. So my question is, what are the lessons they learned from this, right? In terms of this kind of this celebration, or this recognition, this celebration, this forgetting, and this kind of very short-term thinking in terms of investing in female-driven, investing in films for and by Black filmmakers, Latinx filmmakers, right? Asian American filmmakers, queer filmmakers, this idea of this is the one that's going to change everything, and that never happens. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the lessons that they're going to learn from the Barbie movie. It's going to be about the IP. It's not going to be about, or it's going to be pink. It's not gonna,
Ryan Gosling.
Ryan Gosling, right?
Yeah.
This is very. Our work overlaps a lot in this.
I was just going to say
space.
very quickly, it's this sort of this amnesia loop is really sort of about. It is about understanding audiences' understanding of scarcity, and using that understanding of scarcity as a marketing tactic. So in other words, if audiences know that they are understood as scarce, and that if they do not consume the material that is presumably targeted toward them, and it doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or indifferent, but if they don't consume it, then the industry uses that to say, see, we did this thing and y'all didn't come see it, and that's why we're not doing it. But then when we do it and you go see it, then we just get to forget it.
Yeah.
And then we get to treat the next one like it was the first time all over again.
Because it goes back to what I was thinking, sort of trying to say earlier, is who gets access to the franchises, whose franchises or whose stories or who's centered in these franchises, who's allowed into the studios to work on these, who has the creative control, the financial control, who is kind of constructed as in this valuable space, or allowed to be in this valuable space.
And what you're saying is also who's invited back.
And who's invited back, and who's also who's punished when it's a failure, who gets sent to movie jail.
Yeah.
Sent to movie jail. Yeah. Okay, why don't we gather the two questions, and then folks can respond as they see fit. So why don't we get you, and then you.
Okay, great. So I think something that's been common across board is repetition kind of works for audiences. What are the elements that keeps a franchise that's been repeated fresh? I don't know if James Bond would be a good case study, but talk about how the brand has been from 1962 and it's still relevant. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do you want to go?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you for reminding me.
Sorry, this question I've been reformulating in my head for the last few minutes, but for all of the successes that we've talked about in the long-standing games, we've also talked about false starts and flameouts. And Citadel with Amazon kind of speaks to this broader, muddy strategy that they have, or Scott Stuber leading Netflix. What is the future of Netflix still hold? And flameouts like Indiana Jones and Mission Impossible last year not doing the numbers they expected. And I guess I just wanted to ask, like, when the old stalwarts no longer work, what happens? Like, what comes next? Because it seems like a lot of the trades in the wakes of the strikes are projecting more risk aversion from the studios. But when the properties that have been successful no longer are successful, or the stars are aging, what happens? It's really hard to start a franchise. We had 2 last year with Mario and Barbie, but I guess I would just love to hear from the panel, for those that speak to those in the industry and think more broadly about it, like, what comes next? Right? It seems pretty bleak.
And they will find a way to make Oppenheimer into a franchise.
Or we make more reality TV franchises with non-union labor and crews that are a million times cheaper, that don't get to keep residuals. And, there's a reason why in this era that is what has exploded. So I think they found some outlet or answers for that.
But I think we can link them to say that, like, freshness is a particular value here, and so it's not just the desperation to go back and make another Hunger Games, but to say, like, what should the pacing of this be? It doesn't need to be every 3 a year. We're going to watch. I mean, Sony has had a great deal of luck and skill with its Spider-Man part of the MCU. We're going to watch them destroy it this year, right, with this bad Craven movie, with Madam Web, with a third Venom that, like, apparently had some real issues. So, like, even that's going to come apart. It may just be too much. And so the lesson could just be, we need more of them, but paced a little differently, as opposed to one every 4 months. And that could be part of how it works.
Or don't double down on making more Harry Potters. Like that is...
I don't even think they're going to make that.
Like,
That company is so doomed.
I know.
I don't know if you've ever been indebted, like, in a serious way, but when you wake up and every day you're like, what are we going to do? And this is what's going on at Warner Brothers Discovery.
That's the thinking,
and they're
right?
just, like, desperately waiting until April, when they can basically either sell themselves or try to buy their way out. Like, it's a totally unique pocket in that way, compared with Netflix or Amazon, where they don't wake up worried.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really breed brilliant, inspirational creativity. Yeah.
God, is that the note we're ending on?
We can't end on that. We can't end on that.
We can make another Holdovers. Just like a Holdovers franchise. That was fun. Holdovers college years, Holdovers graduate school.
Can you imagine?
Sorry.
Sky's the limit.
Although that didn't work for Saved by the Bell, so.
No, it didn't.
Yeah.
You didn't watch the Hawaii wedding, Saved by the Bell? I did. I watched all of Saved by the Bell.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Let's give a round of applause for the panelists. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you
Enjoy
so
your
much.
evenings.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.